Hello, it's Thor again, and this time it's actually been less than 6 months since the last devlog. And as I mentioned in the last devlog, I'm adding Bandit Camps inspired by the ones in Far Cry and Metro to my game. These Bandit Camps will contain vital resources to progress the gameplay, as you won't be able to complete the game without first having collected parts for the vehicle that the raiders stole from the research facility. Additionally, the idea is that these vehicle parts will also act as powerful upgrades for the vehicle. I haven't implemented these parts yet, but the idea is that you will be able to find them with a sort of a Geiger counter compass, leading you to the Bandit Camps, as the parts are slightly radioactive.
Not great, not terrible.
If you don't know anything about the game, it's titled Scorching Engines and is a game set aboard a giant vehicle in a frozen wasteland where you have to fight for your survival. Inspired by Mortal Engines, Mad Max and Snowpiercer, you have to transport a large heat core aboard an experimental vehicle to humanity's colony and save them from the permanent global winter. I'm solo developing this game while working full-time as a software developer, so progress is a bit slow, but if this sounds interesting and you want to support the project, consider wishlisting the game on Steam with the link in the description, as I would really appreciate it, and wishlists are a very good indicator of a game's potential success. Additionally, you can subscribe to not miss out on new devlogs and videos, or join the Discord to see more frequent updates, where you can also provide feedback and discuss ideas before and during implementation. The Bandit Camps in my game, however, are pretty different from the ones seen in Far Cry and Metro, and not just because my game isn't linear. The biggest difference is that my camps are spawned into a procedurally generated world, which means that I have very limited control over how they play out and where they spawn. One big issue with this procedural spawning is that the terrain has to deform to the shape of the Bandit Camps, so that they aren't floating far above the terrain or buried beneath. Meanwhile, in other games, the Bandit Camps are often shaped to fit the terrain. For example, camps with docks near the water and some up in the hills, partially inside of a cave. Unfortunately, that is very difficult to accomplish when you're procedurally spawning both the world, cities, forests and Bandit Camps. I will, however, try to make it more varied, with special Bandit Camps spawning in the cities, and some with natural terrain formations, such as larger rocks surrounding them, so as to stop the vehicle from getting too close. Later on, when I rework the terrain generation again and add some sort of biomes, I can hopefully also do some more work on creating more varied Bandit Camp locations. For the moment, however, I have gone with a simpler approach of spawning pre-built camp parts, such as different smaller buildings, together with randomly spawned clutter such as barrels, boxes and containers. On top of this, there's also procedurally spawned loot inside of the Bandit Camps according to a loot table, which means that I could have higher tier loot and more of it in more dangerous Bandit Camps. And to make spawning less chaotic and less random, I decide where loot and clutter is allowed to spawn, as well as the frequency on which clutter sizes can spawn where. So I can choose that only barrels are allowed to spawn in the small blue circles, while container stacks or other large clutter can only spawn in the large blue circles. This random spawning is also used to only make some buildings have a scaffolded platform on the roof, which makes the gunplay more vertical as the raiders have the high ground. Unfortunately, due to limited time and the fact that I've got a lot more features to work on, I've only made 2 different buildings for the camps to use so far. But I will be adding more so that there's more variety, where I will also create more Bandit Camp configs with different building models and styling, so I can have the camps in the cities use a different object pool for the buildings and for the clutter. Another difficulty with this procedural spawning is that I have to generate a Navmesh during runtime, where a Navmesh acts as a simple representation of the world, and it limits where AI agents can walk, so that they don't walk through walls. Unfortunately, it is pretty demanding to generate this during runtime, and especially pretty difficult when Unity doesn't have built-in support for navmeshing entities, only game objects. which is a pretty annoying issue when almost everything in your game is made with Unity dots and is therefore an entity. I tried to find a pre-existing solution for this, and I did actually find one, but it kept crashing if I had more than 5 meshes that needed a Navmesh, and unfortunately I have hundreds. Therefore I had to create my own system which collects the different meshes for the Bandit Camps and sends them to the internal Navmesh system to be generated, and then adds the result to the world's Navmesh. I therefore generate a very simplified Navmesh for each terrain chunk when it generates. Then, after spawning Bandit Camps, they deform terrain chunks and also update their Navmesh to be included in the higher resolution Bandit Camp Navmesh, since the higher resolution is needed for indoor pathfinding, as it allows for walls and clutter to affect the Navmesh. However, as mentioned, the runtime generation of Navmeshes is pretty demanding, so I had to do a bit more of advanced Navmesh usage in Unity. This means that I make it so that the terrain Navmeshes are generated in parallel to the main thread mesh generation instead of running afterwards. But, more importantly, I made the Navmesh generation non-blocking, which means that the main thread can keep working on other systems and rendering, and Navmeshes can run over multiple frames if needed. This makes it so that the Navmeshes cause less of a frame rate dip than they would have otherwise. The Navmesh generation for the Bandit Camps, however, isn't fully non-blocking, so that is something I'll try to improve so that the lag spikes of camps spawning aren't as bad. One big limitation with the Navmesh system I've made is that it utilizes a single Navmesh for everything that it generates, which means that all Bandit Camps share the same Navmesh, which is pretty bad for performance, as the Bandit Camps are nowhere near each other, and it means that I cannot unload parts of the Navmesh when the player moves away. Additionally, it also increases the time taken to generate Navmeshes, as it already contains information. But I can somewhat easily rectify that by introducing a chunking system for the Navmeshes, so that each Bandit Camp gets assigned to their own Navmesh. However, since this is a pretty annoying issue to run into, I'm thinking of cleaning up the code and implementing the chunking system and then making it an open source package on GitHub for you guys to use. As mentioned in the last devlog, I replaced the enemy's pathfinding with the Navmeshes, for which I'm using a free package made by the same person that made the Navmesh generating package, which didn't work. Luckily, this one does work, but unfortunately, Unity has deprecated all of the functionality used without any replacement, so hopefully they don't remove it from the engine completely. Together with replacing the pathfinding, I also replaced the movement of the enemies, so that they use the same physics-based character as the player, instead of me manipulating their positions directly. Since I apparently had some pretty clean code, this was 5 lines of code that had to be changed. What this means for gameplay, and for you, is that they now physically react to the environment, pushing objects around, not being able to walk up steep slopes, but more importantly, being able to stand on the vehicle. Which means that now, you can get boarded. There's still a lot of work to do on the bandits, the AI, and their camps, but they're definitely more functional than they were in the previous devlogs. However, it is probably something I will be working on for the entirety of the game's development. There are multiple ways to deform meshes during runtime, depending on your needs. For a simple terrain deformation tool, where you can raise and lower parts where you're clicking, you just get the vertices of the mesh near the mouse and change their height accordingly. For a procedural system, where you spawn in the deformers, i.e. Bandit Camps, it gets a bit more complicated. But I went with the simpler but more expensive solution of brute forcing the terrain deformation by shooting a couple of tens of thousands raycasts from the terrain to the deformers and setting the height accordingly. Before I write a comment telling me that it's very inefficient and I should just get the height of the deformers once and then snap the terrain to the nearest desired height while looping over the terrain vertices, I want to mention that I wanted to support multiple rotated deformers as well as having an interpolated segment of deformed terrain per terrain chunk. What this means is that I define an area where the terrain must be that height, as well as an additional area where if the raycasts hit that, then the terrain height should smoothly interpolate towards the deformer's height. However, it is still pretty demanding, which is why I've made it only deform one terrain chunk per frame, so it's not as noticeable. There are still some mesh calculations that are done on the main thread, blocking other systems due to Unity being a bit finicky and me not having figured out how to do it on a different thread yet. I know that it sounds really bad, and now that I'm talking about it, I want to try rewriting it to a more maths-based approach by using bounce calculations to detect if it should deform or not instead of raycasts. But I've already got more important things to work on than a few infrequent FPS dips from Bandit Camps spawning in. And it's also only around 20,000 raycasts per terrain piece, which isn't that bad when using dots. Additionally, since I'm using this new deformation system instead of the old one for the starting area, it means that it's both much faster, more modular, and looks way better, as before there were often very steep cliffs just outside the cave entrance, making it pretty annoying to play. There's still some work to do on this deformation system, as it sometimes breaks and isn't performing well enough for my liking. Another feature I potentially want to add to it is non-flat deformers, so that I can, for example, deform a hole in the ground to act as a crater from explosions, as it would be pretty cool to have enemy cars leave a hole in the snow when blowing them up. As mentioned, I have a system for spawning the bandit camps, which is given a list of different building prefabs to use for spawning. This allows me to have at least some sort of control over how it is to fight in the bandit camps, as procedurally spawned structures are often pretty bad to fight in. Additionally, it means that I can inject more handcrafted parts into my game instead of everything being procedural, just to give it a bit more personality. This does, however, make it pretty close to how Minecraft does their village spawning, albeit that my terrain deforms to the buildings, instead of the buildings deforming to the terrain. As mentioned, I still have procedural content in the building prefabs that I make, such as the rooftop platforms and the fence around the large buildings, sometimes being broken. On top of this, the clutter that spawns at the buildings is handmade, but procedurally selected and spawned, so that if I make 5 different large clutter pieces, the camps will choose one randomly or not at all. Currently, they're not that detailed, as I'm unsure of how detailed they should be, and even unsure regarding the current look of them, as they look kinda farmhousey, if that's even a word. But I will be making more building variations of differing sizes, which means that the camp variety and gameplay therein should get elevated quite a bit. Additionally, there will, as mentioned, be camps in cities with different styles of buildings. Perhaps I can even make some of these bandit camp buildings be multi-layered skyscraper structures, so that they actually feel like proper parts of the cities. Together with walls made from stacked cars and other city junk, I have an idea for how to make the camps in cities be really cool, theoretically, but if it can actually accomplish that is another question. I really do hope that I can, and I will do my best. And on the topic of walls, currently the only walls for the camps are palisade walls or Czech hedgehogs, aka tank traps, where they just spawn along the bounds of the camps with a sine wave offset plus some random jitter and other minor tweaks to make it look nicer. So quite simple, but pretty effective. And these walls act as a sort of funnel to limit the angles the player can attack from, as well as keeping the vehicle out, as driving the vehicle right up to the bandits and letting the turrets deal with them isn't that conducive to good FPS gameplay, as you don't even lift a finger. Like mentioned during this devlog, there's a lot of work to do, but at the same time there has been a lot of progress. This progress will continue, as the next feature to work on is an overhaul of the gunplay in my game, adding new guns and new handling, as well as making the guns a bit more impactful. I know that in the last devlog I mentioned cities being next on the to-do list, but that list has changed. Instead, the priority is improving the current features in the game, and then working on adding humanity's colony and adding an initial draft of the game's ending, so you can actually play from start to finish. Which is probably something that I should have done already, instead of waiting 2.5 years, but hey, better late than never. This does, however, not mean that the game is nearing its completion, nor does it mean that I won't add more features. It just means that I'm finally realizing that I should have a more playable product before adding more mid-game content that doesn't really accomplish anything. It also means that early access could become a possibility, since the game is actually playable. However, if you're interested in Scorching engines, then you're very welcome to wishlist it on Steam, as we're currently sitting on 243 wishlists, which is far from what's needed before releasing. But thank you very much for watching and for your support. If you want to follow the developments more closely, then you can join the Discord, as I often post what I'm currently working on, and you can provide feedback and discuss ideas before and during implementation.